Back today to talk to Yaffa Tegegne. Did I say that right, Yaffa?
Tegegne.
Tegegne. And we're really delighted to have you. I came across an article you had written in the Canadian press about growing up Ethiopian and the like, and I felt it showed just such such interesting intellectual insights, and I couldn't wait to talk to you. So Yaffa, thank you so much. I'm also here with
My
Monica
pleasure.
Osbourne, yeah, who's a editor at the Jewish Journal. She's also editor of the Speech Project at the Jewish Journal, which curates interesting articles on speech and videos and the like. It's really worth checking out. When I want to look at see who's been writing what, that's what I do. I go on the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal. So glad to have this discussion. So Yaffa was born in Canada. She is a recovering lawyer. She's become a real activist in the Jewish community. She's on the Canadian um, delegation to IRHA, and which is looks at the definition of anti-Semitism and how it's applied. You'll talk more about that. You're active with CJPAC, which is like sort of the Canadian version of APAC, and you become a representative of the Ethiopian Jewish community. So there's a lot to explore, and I also love the stories about your father and so forth. So we can get. Let's start with your background. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be an Ethiopian Jewish activist in Canada.
Well, I have to say, I think the role was just kind of placed upon me due to my background and my family history and the family that I was very fortunate to grow up in. My father was one of the first Ethiopian Jews to be brought to Israel in 1956. They were the first 20 students brought on a pilot project by the Jewish Agency to learn modern Judaism and modern agricultural skills to bring back in an almost development project to Ethiopia. And My mother was born and raised an Ashkenazi Jew in Montreal. We go back 3, 4 generations in Montreal. We're Canadian Jews with roots in the Ukraine, but we're Canadian. And My parents met in Israel in the 70s. My father was still probably only a handful of Ethiopians at the time. My mom knew maybe 100 in the country. And My father essentially lobbied the Israeli government and worked with Mossad and put a lot of political pressure on the Israeli government with the help of American activists, namely Grain and Berger and the American Association for Ethiopian Jews, to pressure
Mhm.
Israel to recognizing the Beta Israel as legitimate Jews and bringing them to Israel under the right of return. So that's the context I grew up in. But I was born in Canada. My parents moved here due to a lot of the discrimination and difficulty that they faced in Israel. So I was born and raised in Canada. And because I'm probably one of the first Ethiopian Jews born outside of Ethiopia or Israel, I've been privileged to have a unique perspective growing up here, and I hope to lend my voice. I've been asked recently, I think with the political climate, especially in the last year after Black Lives Matter, there's been a real interest in hearing more diverse Jewish voices within our community and a real recognition of that, at least in Canada, and I've seen it in the States a bit as well. So I'd say that I've been asked to engage my voice and to help share my experience and that of my community within North America, and how we can contribute both to fighting anti-Semitism and having greater inclusion and understanding within our community.
Mm, great. So right after the murder of George Floyd, there was something called the Harper's Letter. It was written by Thomas Chatterton Williams, and it was signed by a group of intellectuals. And it basically, mostly liberals, and it basically stated that on the one hand, we have a much needed racial reckoning in the United States that we have to deal with and we have to talk about. On the other hand, we can't do it in a way that stifles dissent, that stifles argument, that prevents us from being able to talk about these issues, citing data about police brutality and the like. And I've also heard that a similar process, not perhaps identical, has gone on in Canada, where you have both of these ideas sort of playing out in the public square at once. And wondered if how you would characterize that, how you see that as somebody who's had your unique upbringing.
Well, first of all, I think that the American legal and political landscape is different from Canada. And I think Americans are learning that right now, that they will pay a lot of consequences for their concept of freedom and the constitutional limits of their freedoms. Where in Canada, for example, we've had hate speech legislation, for example, and it's very specifically geared at speech that incites violence, and and attacks minorities or racial minorities. There is ways that we've been able to limit speech and not have been, oh well, it's just complete silencing of dissent or anything. There are ways of framing laws that help to curb violence and violent attack and spread anti-Semitism. So I think we've been able to address that here in Canada, and I think that this is now taking on the next steps of how we address that in social media forums and on the internet. And I think that Canada is actually preparing legislation in draft right now to deal with that. And that's something that I think that even globally, we're starting to understand that we have to deal with. So that is, I think, something that America is going to have to understand as well and reckon with, that if freedom of speech and dissent does not come at all costs, and that all of our freedoms are limited in time and place and manner and context by the Constitution. And I think it's something that I don't know if Americans will get there, but I think that it's something that is being addressed progressively in Canada and some European states.
Do you have any sense about the ideological environment apart from the sort of legal structure, about whether speech has become, I don't mean constricted in the legal sense in Canada, but has been stifled, that do you feel like the conversation is as honest and open as it needs to be around issues of race and racism, or do you feel like it's closed down since sort of the post George Floyd order has taken?
So I think that depends what conversations you're having and with who. On the one hand, there seems to be, at least at a federal level or on a higher policy level, there seems to be let's pay homage to, let's make a nod to this group or nod to that group in a very superficial way. And it's, we see that a lot in Canada, not really addressing a lot of the real issues with discrimination. On the other hand, you're seeing, and I've experienced forums and platforms online that are opening up discussions and honest discussions, honest discussions between a lot of groups that are being constructive and that I hope will become more mainstream as we're going forward. I think in the Jewish community, for the first time, I've seen a lot of people addressing, racism within our community and how are we going to be more inclusive. This is a relatively new thing. So I feel that more open spaces dealing with racism and more honest conversations are happening on a micro level, but on the other hand, you have that same, on the macro policy level, as well as the insane hatred and vehement, anti-Semitism and racism that's also come out on the internet. So it's really hard to gauge. And I think that there needs to be really more targeted and more constructive research geared at understanding what is being said and what is the mainstream conversation and how those trends are changing and what the Jewish community is, how we're changing as well.
One last question. I'm turn to Monica. So, one of the things we're looking at is sort of woke ideology, if you will. Could be, there's other names for it. I'm not sure any of them are completely satisfactory to most people. And every time I use one name, I either have to explain it more than I'd like, or I have to apologize for its incompleteness. But but sometimes people know what we mean. And the question is, I guess I would have for you is, do you see that as a problem on the Canadian scene? Is that preventing authentic conversations, or do you think those are that's exactly how it should be?
I think that type of where we are now versus where we are 10 years ago, has allowed us to have the honest conversations. I think that woke ideology, perhaps I'm not of the generation, I'm not a millennial, but for me, I find it quite enlightening that people are having this level of conversation about these things. On the flip side, obviously, we are seeing unintended consequences of this, and we are seeing people with, having to engage or take a position with high moral authority about stuff in order to comply with some vision of who they are or their identity or social norms or groups. And this is where the problem lies. The problem is, will I be rejected if I don't hold a very moral stance about something, or I'm not a perceived moral stance, frankly, as to, and you don't want young people to feel like that, but it's also normal that young people in their 20s feel like that. That's the time in your life where you are the most passionate about things and think you can change. So, there's obviously a flip side to both. I think that the conversation is progressing, and we are starting to understand now the unintended consequences of this wokeness and where the limits, the differences are between actual progress, human rights, equality, and just, taking a stance on Facebook and what the negative consequences of that are as well. So it's happening. I think the awakening is happening. We're starting to understand the consequences of what's been going on lately.
Monica?
Thanks, Yaffa. So you described yourself, among many other things, as a recovering lawyer, right? And I describe myself as a recovering academic. And I think there are some similarities there. But the reason I bring that up is because, in the legal world, just like the academic world, probably more so in the academic world, the topic and idea of intersectionality is a big thing, right? And, I am a former English professor. I've taught critical theory, I've taught critical race theory, and I've taught intersectionality as a very useful way of understanding the ways in which all of our competing and, not competing identities intertwine. But as you describe other elements of your background, it seems to me that, if we're talking about intersectionality, you kind of sit, at the center of this in terms of all of the different facets of your identity. So I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about, whether you see intersectionality in the way we use it today, the way we talk about it, as a hindrance or a help or both, and then whether you see that, manifesting in different ways in Canada as opposed to the United States.
So I think the theory in itself was necessary at its point in time to kind of frame these conversations and to maybe have people have more empathetic understanding of other people's realities. I think the issue and where we'll go with identity is that, identity is not just visible identities. Intersectionality tends to focus on visible identities, and we understand that, but there are identities that shape us that are much greater than just our visible identity, and that can skew the presumptions of intersectionality completely off. For example, my experience, and I have to say, yes, I've had some discrimination, but I'm extremely privileged to live in Canada, where I have been granted great equality in my life. I've been privileged to have opportunity and education. I've had a lot more privilege than a lot of other people in many ways. So it doesn't I'm not inherently, excluded from the power structures because of my intersectional identity as a woman. I've had to fight maybe a little bit harder on some fronts and in some situations, but I don't think that I've grown up in that reality. And I think that we're also kind of moving past it, because if you look at the imagery and everything that we're seeing, just in pop culture and everything, we are moving past it. Like, where does this end? The question is, where does this end? When have we reached the goal? When have we reached the goals of equality? When have we reached, what are our barriers, our metrics for understanding what our successes, and when can we appreciate those successes? And when can we take the time to acknowledge those successes within the context of still being critical and moving society forward? I think you have to have both those conversations. I don't think the situation is the same in Canada versus the US. Canada has a very different demographic landscape. We did not have the same history of slavery. We don't have that kind of, I hate to say it, but that original sin of the United States, formation. A lot of Black people here in Canada mostly are immigrants from Caribbean, Africa, other places. It's not kind of, we have it, but we don't have the same demographics that the problem plays out in the same way or to the same level. We have different problems with immigrant communities, with Aboriginal communities, I'd say is one of our biggest issues that we're trying to address today. So yeah, it is different, but I think that it was necessary at a time. But again, we have to contextualize the conversation and understand who's using these terms, where they're being used, how they're being used, and are they being misused? And in the halls of power, are they being misused and manipulated, and how?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think you really nail it when you say that what intersectionality doesn't really address are identities or facets of identity that aren't visible. And especially if we're talking about something like Jewish identity, you can't always look at someone and tell they're Jewish. So, and I think that's why I'm curious what your thoughts about this are, but my sense is that is why intersectionality has been an issue for Jewish women, even, right? Because there's this other invisible facet of their identity that isn't addressed by intersectionality. And I think sometimes the facets that are invisible or aren't addressed end up getting pushed into the oppressor category. And I know I read something you wrote or something you said, you talked about the idea of just, being, as a Jewish woman of color, being lumped into these two categories simultaneously, right? You're both, oppressor and oppressed simultaneously, which is this bizarre kind of existence that intersectionality claims to account for, but doesn't.
It doesn't. And I hope as we go forward, and what I learned a long time ago, or at least in my 20s, was that, there's a principle in Judaism, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." You treat others as you want to be treated. And that, if people embodied that really in their thoughts, in their daily lives, in their interactions, and stopped trying to categorize, because I think that even on a psychosocial level, we will hopefully, we can maybe train our brains to go there and start really seeing people as people and not categories of people. And I believe, like Saplovsky, there's theories that we are hardwired in this way for whatever, historical reasons. But we can undo the way we think about others and start to see people as just the entirety of all their identities whenever you meet somebody. And it's just so much, that's where we need to be going, like maybe, society catches up. Society moves slowly. Social change doesn't happen in, even 10 years. It happens slowly. It's happening faster now, but it happens slowly. So everything serves its purpose at the time and contributes to the conversation going forward. So hopefully we will move past this, and that my kids, who are a quarter Persian Jewish and a quarter French Canadian and a quarter this and a quarter that, like, nobody will care, and they'll just be people, and that will be the end of it, and we can all just move on from this.
Yeah.
That would be good. I want to ask you a little bit about anti-Semitism. So the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values recently put out a white paper on we call it the critical social justice ideology and anti-Semitism. And the thesis is that whenever you have an ideology that claims sort of inviolable truth, in other words, it's not the problem. Like, we can all agree that there is injustice embedded in society, but when you start to say injustice is embedded in society, and I have a singular claim to be able to describe it, you sort of open the door for more radical ideas to come in. You're saying, okay, we get to define society for you, and therefore you're able to sort of push through a oppressor versus oppressed narrative. You'll be able to sort of define who has privilege and who doesn't for society. You create the conditions in which anti-Semitism may be able to thrive, a more illiberal condition for all people, including Jews. But when there's a liberalism in society, that tends not to be good for Jews. So do you see that? Or do you think that maybe we're overstating the case for anti-Semitism and its relationship with this ideology?
Absolutely not. And I think that how critical social justice theory or intersectionality, these theories come about as conversations in academic circles that are tempered with research and discussion and parameters versus how they're played out in the mainstream popular society are two very different things. And that's with, most concepts and theories and philosophies. So in terms of anti-Semitism, I think that, I thought about this a lot recently, and I was like, why is this happening? Like, why is Israel at the forefront of congressional debate? Why is Israel being evaluated on a higher standard than everybody else when it comes to human rights? Why is Israel's relationship with the United States always in the media versus Israel's relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, or Egypt, or any other country that, perpetrates a variety of human rights violations across the world and that receives tremendous amount of military aid as well? Why? I still can't wrap my head around it. So at the end of the day, I have to come back to exactly what you said. We create, or the discussion, the mainstream discussion leads to this creation of a scrutiny on Jews and Israel and our relations and our everything, and our society beyond that of everyone else. And I can't understand why. And the only thing I can come down to is this historical relationship that Jews have with the world, which is anti-Semitism, unfortunately. And it just keeps coming back. And I think that we have this relationship because we are the eternal minority, and because we have been an eternal global minority for history. And everybody has had some interaction, knowledge, of a Jewish community, where they're from, some terrible story in history, some wherever, because, that's unique perhaps to Jews, maybe Armenians, certain groups, but it is really unique to Jews historically. And I realized as a Black person, Africans don't understand racism. They only understand racism when they're brought to somewhere else where they are a minority. It's always relational as a minority. So because we're a perpetual minority, I don't know how we avoid this. I don't know what the right things, how we combat it, how we change the conversation, because it doesn't seem to matter how religious or secular or integrated or powerful that we are. It seems to be this continuous theme and experience that we have as Jews globally. And I think that we just have to be conscious and active, and always be active in our, in our relationships, not just with people in the halls of power, but every day who we speak to as Jews, because we are Jews. Everyone, whatever you say is projected on the group, and to continue to be a light, to a light amongst nations, a light amongst people. Focus on the positive in all your interactions, and try and contain, or at least manage the vocabulary of the conversation that's happening.
Monica, you have other questions? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, David.
I just one follow-up, but do you see that there's any, in the current sort of great awakening, as it's been called, is adding any fuel to the fire there? Or do you think it's just anti-Semitism is always going to exist, and it really doesn't matter what other conversations are taking place?
I think that anti-Semitism is, unfortunately, I do think it will exist in some level, in some place. I don't think you can control the thoughts and actions of all people. The question is, it's kind of like the virus. At times it's low, at times it's high. The question is it affecting our medical system? Are people dying from it? It's endemic. It's here. The question is, how is it affecting people on the streets and families? Is it mean that we're subject to violence, like we've seen in the last few months after the last conflict, where we saw an increase in uptick in violent acts towards Jews? Are we safe? Are we not safe? Is, are we safe in our society? Like in Canada, I'd say we're relatively, we're okay here. We enjoy rights, we're protected. Or, at the worst expression, something like Nazi Germany, which we've experienced all that, in history. So anti-Semitism is a gauge of society. It's a the canary in the coal mine. where are we? How are people reacting to each other? Are we getting violent? And is ethnic nationalism or divisions or polarization becoming a violent problem? Like, where are we? So now I think that we're starting on an uptick. I think that the conversation is starting to get and to turn a little bit more violent than we're perhaps have seen, at least in my generation. We grew up in a time of relative peace. But we're starting to see it for the first time, that like people I know are on the street getting harassed and don't feel safe wearing a kippah, or look what happened in France France has been terrible over the last 15, 20 years even. So yes, it is getting worse right now. And unfortunately though, until we really deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which we really do have to deal with, and we have to start thinking outside the parameters of what's been before. There's a new generation of Israelis and new generations of Palestinians. There might be new ideas. This is not an unfixable problem that needs to perpetuate and continue forever and ever. We need to deal with it.
Right. The whole idea of violence is something that I return to again and again. In my own work, it's something that I deal with, and I think it probably goes without saying that every time there is a social movement, a movement that is fighting for change. You said something a second ago about the idea of social change happening. It doesn't happen overnight. But I think sometimes these movements and activists in different movements, they want that change overnight, right? And if they can't have it immediately, if they can't have it overnight, it seems like that is when there's a propensity for violence. But I'm curious what you would have to say about this, because again, like the Israel-Palestine issue is something we've been dealing with for a long time. It's something that we'll be dealing with indefinitely, especially if we don't find new ideas, and as you say, find ways to think outside of the box. But I guess a question for me, and I'd love to hear what you think about it, is, to what degree is the violence we're seeing now directed at Jews? I mean, to what degree is that connected to social change that we're not seeing overnight? Because, from an American perspective, it seems that, to me anyway, it's been wrapped up in a lot of the progressive movements. It's been intertwined with them, and yet it's this separate issue. So I've just kind of been struggling to figure out how the pieces fit together. I don't even know if that's a fair question.
I think first of all, I think it comes from both, and it's always come from both sides, right? And historically, it's never been, right? We've had violence against it from both sides of the left or the right, or however the construct is. Yes, maybe now Jews who historically have, at least in contemporary history, have felt a home within the Democratic Party, or have felt safety within the comforts of the left and liberals, and have voted left. All of a sudden, this is new. This is a new experience for us, because we saw it as, you still had the neo-Nazi rallies in North Carolina. Whenever it was coming there too, but we didn't know us. We had never felt it. Ask Jews of Russia, who'd grown up in communism. They understood it from the left also, but for us it was a new experience. So maybe it's a bit more pronounced in our head. I can't tell you statistics and where those acts are coming from right now, or maybe it's because it's more visceral and it's online for the first time that we're seeing it coming from our own social circles and our own political parties, and are things that we typically, Jews typically aligned with very progressive movements and values, and to feel turned on, and to feel like you've lost your political home. And I've worked and spoken to so many young people who feel like this, who really don't understand how they can be allowed, how they're allowed to be Jewish, allowed to support Israel and their families, while still remaining in their progressive political, cultural, artistic, student, educational circles, and still stand beside other rights movements. And we shouldn't have to be put in that situation. It's not, we're people. And if anything, we've contributed to a lot of, human rights development and work and law. I mean, the entire international human rights framework was based on what happened to Jews. People forget this, but the Nuremberg, everything is like, who do they, how can people turn and call us white? If the actual term Aryan was used to define us as non-Aryan, how are we white all of a sudden? It's just mind-boggling. But people don't know history. People don't know, they read memes. And we're in a time of post-truth and miseducation and false news. And, the question is, how are we as a community going to stand up to that?
Would you talk about the kind of conversation we just had? Do you talk about that with your friends, or when you gather in a Jewish community? Is this the kind of conversation you're having now, or are we just sort of doing something outside your normal experience?
Oh, I mean, actually, I'd say that this last year I've had far more conversations like this. I've become more engaged online, and I've found different communities of people that are like-minded and that want to have these forums and these spaces and share this experience, whether it's on Clubhouse or on, we have different Jews of Color Canada. Lots of things. So I'm having these conversations, but I'm also at the center of this conversation. My identity puts me at the center of this conversation. So I don't know if this is what's happening in, a lot of spheres, but I went to a lecture 2 nights ago by Rudy Rochman. I don't know if you guys know him. He's an advocate, but he's a 28-year-old Israeli that's having a progressive conversation and trying to ignite that new conversation in Jewish circles and in Jewish mainstream. So I think the seeds are there, I hope.
One last question about this. One of the things that I'm playing with and I'm writing about, but I'm still, figuring it out in my own head about what I think is, does the Jew, I've been involved mostly on the Jewish left. I mean, I still am much more comfortable and feel at home on the left in general in society than I would on the right. And certainly with sort of a populist right, I would feel fundamentally alienated. Yet, as sort of the left has become more ideological, I'm increasingly not at home on the American left either. And so, okay, so what does one do? And it seems to me that there might be an opportunity to start to piece together sort of a center left to center right coalition that above all stands for sort of liberal values, liberal democratic values, and that those issues become more important than the sort of whatever else divides us center left to center right, that if first and foremost you have to take care of those fundamental values. And that's sort of where I'm starting to move in that direction, but I'm wondering what you think of that. And I don't know, it might be slightly different in the Canadian scene. So, love to get that nuance as well.
So I completely agree with you. And I think that the Canadian political scene is different. I hope, and I'm thinking, or people are hopeful, that Biden is a bit of that, voice that kind of, is that traditional democratic value system. But unfortunately, there is the fraction within the Democratic Party that's taking it a new route. But that doesn't mean that they'll become the mainstream ideal. And there might be, there might be more and more people that feel like us and that become more supportive of a more centrist position. But I do not foresee the American political system developing any new political parties of any significance. Unfortunately, I think it's just, the systems are far too entrenched the way they are. In Canada, it is a little bit different because we have a parliamentary system. So we have a multi-party system. We still have our main parties, Liberal and Conservative, but we also have the New Democrats, and we have a Green Party. And we've actually recently had the emergence of an extreme right-wing party called the PPC, Extreme Conservative Party, which we never really had. And they gained slightly bit more gains in this last federal election. So Canada, definitely. I think that, our Liberal Party, which I guess would be like the Democrats, but not really, would still be, far more liberal than anything that the Democrats actually are. It's our country generally is far more left leaning, I would say, if you're looking on a global scale than the States. We have socialized medicine, which is a pillar of Canadian society that people are really, really hold on to as a value of Canadian society. We have much greater social welfare. We have public education, subsidized daycare, subsidized university. It's really a different starting point. So you can come to Canada if you're interested and visit.
It sounds like it.
I spent last year in Canada, and it was so interesting to see, because I just kind of assumed that the left and the right were really the same thing. But so many of the things that the Democrats are still fighting for in the US are a starting point in Canada. I mean, it's like old news. It was an interesting year.
When there's all this discussion about Roe v. Wade being challenged in the States, I think that our Conservative Party at times has tried to take a similar strategy to the Republicans and play to this space but it's never really been an issue. It's not an issue. I wouldn't say it's a great issue that's at threat here, that it is a right at threat in Canada, or that it's that conversation is not a mainstream conversation. And the fact that it's still a conversation in the United States is very shocking to me and other Canadians sometimes. Really, this is America. This should be entrenched already. These are things that should be past discussion, but they're not. America has its own demographics and political destiny and way of dealing with, its population and representation. And it's definitely very different than Canada. We also only have 35 million people here. It's not the same.
Right.
It's not the same
Right.
beast.
Big landmass, but a lot fewer people. I just one last. I've sort of seen some of Justin Trudeau's comments that almost feel like pandering to me around gender and gendered language and so forth. And they come across to me as really silly. And I don't. You would never see maybe a mainstream Democrat, maybe AOC or but most mainstream Democrats would never. Make such comments, yet obviously he's still electable in Canada. What does that come from? What's he trying to do there?
He's a politician like any, and I think that he says what he thinks people want to hear. But it did come up. There was a lot of criticism in this election that there wasn't any constructive policy or successful policies to back up a lot of the statements that he made, and in his first election, and that in the last 6 years he hasn't actually successfully moved the needle on any of these progressive policies that he's claimed to support. Most notably, and I think two things in the newspaper yesterday. So we've declared a national day of mourning for the residential schools, the children of the residential schools, and now it is in Canada it's a national day. And he was caught surfing on vacation in BC when he was invited by the chief of I don't remember which tribe in BC to come attend a ceremony that day. He also there was a conflict, and there was a big conflict with the former Minister of Justice, who was Native. That was part of the last, a scandal, and ultimately he pushed her out of caucus. He pushed her out of the party because she challenged him on a corruption scandal. And so anytime that there's been any woman in power here, and note, we did have a Black Jewish woman as head of a federal party in this last election, of the federal Green Party, and she was also recently resigned because she couldn't handle the amount of scrutiny and criticism and what a difficult from within her own party and in general. So it's pretty obvious. I don't think that anybody here is falling for it necessarily. We know, but we also, as Canadians, we tend to like our reputation we like that he says these things globally and that we look like the nice, peace-loving, Canadians that have it all together and that, everything is fine up here. Like, we're doing okay, but it's not perfect.
That's great. Well, you're such a unique voice. And I'm so glad someone shared an op-ed that you wrote that led me to sort of track you down a little bit, which wasn't that easy, but I'm glad we found you. And I hope that we can find other ways of having you in conversations that we have here about identity, about ideology, about the current moment. And really appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to have engaging conversations on these subjects. So it's my pleasure.